Amen. Thank you, Anna-Reen. I'm going to hire her as my PR agent, I think. She always fills me up. Good morning, everybody. Lovely to see you all here this morning, and what a fantastic time of worship we had. We've been on a journey, a series looking at the subject of finding peace in an anxious world. Do catch up on the previous talks if you've missed any of them, because we have been hearing how to thrive in a busy, noisy world. And you know, if you read accounts of Jesus' life and his ministry, you realize he lived in a busy, noisy world as well. His days were often action-packed. We're going to be looking at a few verses from Mark's Gospel this morning. And if you ever read through Mark's Gospel, it's quite breathless, really. It's Jesus did this, and then he did that, and then he did this, and then he did that. There's a lot going on. Not surprising, really, because Jesus had a lot to do in a comparatively short time. What is maybe surprising is how often Jesus leaves all that busyness behind and he just goes off on his own to be quiet. Have you noticed that? It's actually a pattern that Jesus set for his life very early on. So we know that he gets baptized, and that's like the start of his ministry. He's an adult, start of his ministry. And what is the first thing that he does? A massive advertising campaign, going on tour, maybe with Anna-Reen, to tell everybody how great he is. Does he go off to pick his disciples, get his team together? No. We're told that the first thing he does after being baptized is actually goes off into the wilderness. And when I read that word wilderness, I always think it's like a barren desert place. But actually the word could just mean a quiet place, a solitary place. And what happens next is the devil comes along and tries to pick him off, tries to tempt Jesus to abuse the powers that he has. And the devil fails. And it's strange, isn't it? Because Jesus is all alone. He's hungry because he's been fasting for a number of days. You'd expect him to be very vulnerable in that place. But it seems rather that quiet, solitary place was actually somewhere that gave him strength. He comes out of that 40-day-long solitary experience with a really clear sense of who he is, what he's about, and he goes off and starts his mission. And Jesus keeps that pattern of going off to be on his own. Time and time again, we read that he has a busy day, and then you and I, after that sort of day, might think, I've earned a lie-in tomorrow, but this is what Jesus does. First chapter of Mark, verse 35. I'll just read you the chapter headings, the paragraph headings before that. Jesus calls his first disciples, drives out an impure spirit. Jesus heals many. Verse 35, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. And we're going to look at another example of this later on in Mark's Gospel, chapter 6. Let me summarize what happens in that chapter. Before the couple of verses that we're going to focus on, we read that Jesus goes and teaches in the synagogue. The audience is not as kind to him as you are going to be to me. They're pretty hostile, so that doesn't go so well. Then he sends out his team of disciples to do the stuff. And then almost as an aside in chapter 6, we read the horrible story about the beheading of John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin, the man who baptized Jesus, the man who was sent before Jesus to prepare the way for him. A terrible bereavement, and busyness. That's the background to verses 30 to 32 of chapter 6, which we're going to read together. If you've got a Bible, do turn to them. Otherwise, do look up on the screen. So verse 30. The apostles gathered round Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. So Jesus and his disciples head off to a quiet, solitary place. In our series about finding peace in an anxious world, this morning we are focusing on silence and solitude. I love, Tom Wright is a theologian we often quote, and I love his translation of verse 31. He says, Jesus says, "All right, it's time for a break. It's time for a break." And I wonder how good we are at recognizing when it's time for a break. Verse 31 says they didn't even have a chance to eat. It was a warning sign. I mean, I'm a 3 meals a day girl, okay? So missing lunch is a big red flag. Something is amiss. So it might be that for you, or it might be that you notice the warning sign of maybe not having enough time for your friends. Or maybe when you're with your friends and family, you're quite distant. You find it difficult to be really present with them. Maybe this morning you're even feeling burnt out, exhausted, anxious. We need to practice doing what Jesus did, which is taking time out in the midst of busyness, preferably before we get those sort of warning signs, and preferably before we find ourselves maybe turning to a glass of something alcoholic at the end of a busy day, or maybe before we find ourselves just scrolling through stuff on the internet that's not very helpful. Jesus knew the power of having a rested soul. And when we're busy, very often the first thing that we do is just drop those quiet times with Jesus because of our busyness. And actually, what we need is more quiet time, not less. Jesus needed it. What makes me think that I don't? Maybe our objection is a very good one. There's so much to do. So much to do. Jesus ministered to thousands and thousands of people. And he urges us to serve others, doesn't he? He urges us to help people in need. But he also sets a really good example of setting boundaries. Setting boundaries in our lives. At times he just walks away, or here he sails away. If you read the accounts of Jesus' life, you'll find that Jesus actually spends quite a bit of time trying to get away from the crowds. I think there's a lesson there for those of us who find ourselves trying to please the crowds. The key is that Jesus knew what to say yes to and what to say no to. It's a big life lesson, isn't it? I have to keep relearning it. It's not one that you just get in an instant. For example, I really love the opportunities that we have here to serve others. Alarine kindly mentioned my involvement in the compassion ministry. It's lovely to be able to show people how much God loves them. But the needs are endless. I can't rely on other people to set boundaries for me. I need to do that. And what I know, what I am learning, is that taking time out allows me to get God's perspective on what my priorities ought to be. So hear this. Being alone doesn't turn us off from people. Actually, what it does, it makes us more sensitive and more compassionate. Because you could look at what Jesus did. He has so much to offer, yet he walks away from crowds. Is he being selfish? Is he being mean? No. He knows that the silence and the solitude restores us. And it restores us so well that when we're back with people, our time with them can be so much more meaningful. And as I talk about being alone, being quiet, I wonder how you feel about that. Does it conjure up this sort of picture for you? Nice warm bath, nice scented bubbles, maybe a few candles, lock the bathroom door, ignoring the kids outside, just relaxing, nice me time. Or does it conjure up a picture like this for you? Because being alone, being quiet, can be quite scary, can't it? I mean, solitary confinement, we use that as a punishment, don't we? We lock people away on their own. Solitude is not the same as loneliness. Loneliness is, if you've ever felt lonely, it's a feeling of inner emptiness. Solitude is different. Solitude can bring you inner fulfillment. As we open ourselves up to God, it's like nourishing our soul rather than draining it. You know, if you are experiencing loneliness at the moment, then would you reach out? Would you reach out? It is an empty feeling, and we'd love to come alongside you and pray for you later on in our service before you go home. I want to spend the rest of our time thinking about some of the practicalities about that are involved in enjoying silence and solitude. And the first practical point is that we need to find our space. We need to find our space. So Jesus had a pattern of setting off in a boat or climbing up a mountain. Now, I don't know what your lifestyle is like, but those options are not very often open to me, okay? So we need to get practical here. I have a particular chair in a particular room. I create my quiet space there. That might not work for you. Maybe your noise is really busy and noisy. Your house is really busy and noisy. Maybe a bench in the park would be a good place to head for. But sitting still isn't for everyone, so maybe going for a walk. Not necessarily up a mountain, but going for a walk just in your local neighborhood. It used to be that if you were walking along talking to yourself, people gave you strange looks. They were a bit worried about your health. But it happens all the time now, doesn't it? You know, do you notice people going by and you realize they've got something in their ear? So you can get away with walking along and chatting to God, and nobody will think anything bad about you at all. For all my years that I spent commuting, I actually managed to find a quiet space on a crowded commuter train. It is possible. And headphones make finding that quiet even easier. And I love being on my own in my car. It's a nice, quiet, solitary space. As I got in the car this morning, I switched the radio off, had a bit of silence, and then I was chatting to God. And this is a habit that I've had for a while. And I may just have to make some adjustments, because a few weeks ago, I got a new car that has different technology. Now, this technology will be super familiar to you, but I'm a bit behind the times, so it's new for me. So there I was a couple of weeks ago, I think it was on the way to church, chat to God. And then suddenly, a voice filled the car. I'm sorry, I didn't understand that. And I knew it wasn't God, because he does understand me. So I may need to get the handbook out and work out how to switch that particular feature off for moments like that. But it can be a nice space. We need to find a space. Maybe we need to take up Jesus' challenge and get up early. Maybe that's the only time you will find space, maybe before the kids get up. What I'm saying is we need to think how we do some reordering of our lives. Be intentional about making this happen. And every now and again, it's good to make space for a really long time of space, of solitude and quietness, going on a retreat. I've done it a few times in my life. I wish I'd done it more, to be honest. If you Google Christian retreat centres, you'll find somewhere nearby, but you don't need to spend a lot of money. You don't need to go away for the night. A few years ago, when I was thinking and praying about retiring from my full-time work, I paid just a few pounds to have a room for a day in a convent in Molesey. I looked it up this week. It cost £20. And if you don't want to spend £20, another option, This is what happened in my small group a good few years ago. Somebody just borrowed my front room. They knew that I was out at work all day, and they said, do you mind if I go to your house where I can get some quiet? And I knew them well. It was fine. It was free. But I think we can make more of all the little opportunities that we get during the day for silence and solitude because they're there. Tell me what you do when you're waiting to meet somebody. How do you use that time? Or maybe you've met up with them and you're in the coffee shop and they go to the counter, and for some reason your triple shot decaf oat milk macchiato is taking some time to arrive. Or maybe you've had your coffee and they've popped to the loo. What do you do with that moment? I'll confess to my addiction. Oh, I've got a minute. Don't want to miss out on somebody trying to get in touch with me in those 5 minutes. We have these little opportunities, these little moments in our day, the busiest of days, when we can just be quiet and listen to God. We are so afraid of being bored and out of touch, aren't we? So afraid. This is what Ronald Rolheiser said. He's a Catholic father. He said, we are distracting ourselves into spiritual oblivion. So we need to find our space. The other points I'm going to make are going to be quicker, don't worry. Second point is we need to quieten the noise. There's a lot of noise around us. This is what John Mark Comer wrote in his book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. It's a book we've referred to a few times in this series. It's a really good read. He said, the noise of the modern world makes us deaf to the voice of God, drowning out the one input we most need. So it's good to include silence in our daily rhythms. I'll tell you what I do. I set a timer. Start with 5 minutes. You can increase that as you get good at this. But if you set a timer, it stops you constantly, as you're sitting there in silence, just checking the time. Because when you first start, 5 minutes will feel like an eternity. That will feel like a long, empty space. And what happens then is worries start, thoughts will intrude. I will be replaying the conversation that didn't go so well yesterday. I'll dwell on something that makes me anxious. But what we can do is we can just learn to acknowledge those sort of thoughts and let them go. And as we sit silently, get God's perspective. And he brings us peace. Meditation and contemplation are really good Christian practices. They got a bit hijacked by hippies a few years ago, and so we can be a little bit suspicious and think, oh, that's something for a yoga retreat or something like that. But these are good Christian practices to sit quietly. We can use techniques like mindfulness to help us to be really present in that moment. A while ago, Jason was preaching. You know Jason? American, funny, loud. Yes? Yeah, great guy. And he recommended something that I picked up and I've been using ever since, called Soul Space. It's a completely free app. Have we got a picture of it? Great. Because when Jason recommended it, I started looking for an app called Soul Space, and I just got lots of yoga teachers and all sorts of strange things. So that's what it looks like when you're looking for the app. It gives you 5 to 6 minutes of meditation on scripture. And each day they say this time of contemplation is designed to anchor your soul to the love of God. It's really helpful, really helpful. I find it's an effective way of calming my thoughts, and then I'm in a good place to spend some time in silence. So I would recommend that. You might be wired slightly differently, and worship music might be your way of leading into just a few minutes where you've set your timer and you spend your time quietly listening to God. Which leads me to my next point, which is expect to hear God. We're not just taking time out to have a little rest. The aim of taking time out and being alone and being quiet is to get close to God and hear him speak. Don't know if you know the story about Elijah, a really amazing prophet who got very discouraged and very down. And he ran away. He was really in need of a break. This guy had lots of warning signs that he needed a break. He ran away, and he was told to expect to hear God speak. But he didn't hear God when the wind was blowing, and he didn't hear God in the great claps of thunder. He heard God in a whisper. Let's not miss those whispers. You know, God promises, Psalm 23, that he will make me lie down in green pastures. He will lead me by quiet waters, and he will restore my soul. It's a promise. So we should be expectant that that's what will happen. And then my fourth and final practical point is that we will fail at this. Now you might think, did I not get the memo about the preaching always being encouraging? But let's get real. Let's get real. This is what happens to Jesus. After those verses that we just read together, so they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place, but many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. Jesus' plan for silence and solitude was foiled. Life happens, and it will happen to us. How often did we read about the disciples dropping off to sleep when they were supposed to be waiting and praying? It's tough. If Jesus fails in his bid for solitude, then I guess we have to accept that that might happen to us as well. But he is just temporarily put off. Because after he's fed 5,000, this is what we read, verses 40 and onwards. No, that's not right, 45. So after the feeding of the 5,000, busy day, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. Finding time on our own, getting some silence can be hard. As I was preparing for this talk, I kept reading time and time again that this can be one of the most difficult spiritual practices. But I'd leave you with this thought. Give it a go. Maybe give it another go. Maybe it's a practice that you've let slip. Keep pressing into it. And like Jesus, just try again.